Are you ready to bounce?
My name is Corey Rockbottom Davis. I am a comic artist and writer. One of my titles is Jet Boy. And we are in the process now of converting the comic version of Jet Boy into animated Jet Boy, which adds to my list of titles, animation director. And this is like my first time venturing into that realm, but I am in good hands and as far as guidance goes. So pretty much that's the long and short of my duties.
Carmen Pizarro. I'm a New York-based illustrator. I've been working since I graduated from college from the School of Visual Arts, and I've worked on a couple of comics, stuff for Verizon, Comedy Central. So I've done like a little bit of everything, and then I've done like a few editorial pieces for some magazines.
I'm an independent animator and cartoonist, and I make a comic book called In the Dark. It's a kind of crazy, wild adventure about a man named Fibble who accidentally gets stuck in hell, kind of like where I am right now. And the main story is about him trying to get out of it. Along the way, he meets a bunch of crazy, wild, like demons and monsters, all of them sort of connected to social commentary aspects of our own world. And as another introduction, I also do a cartoon called Schizo, the 1920s Killer Bear, and he's sort of an offshoot that came from the comic books.
So yeah, I'm Sloan Leong. I'm a mixed indigenous cartoonist, writer, author. I've dabbled in cartoons as well, done storyboards. I would say my work is focused on a lot of science fiction, though I just recently did a slice of life book called A Map to the Sun, right there, which is my newest book, came out like last week, and is about 5 girls that are forced to join their school's basketball team. Yeah, so I feel like my work is pretty niche. I'm really into delving into the specifics of like my cultural heritage and the stories within that sphere. So on like my mom's side, I'm Mexican, Native American. On my dad's side, I'm Chinese, Hawaiian. And there's just a rich cultural history there that I just feel isn't explored like broadly, but especially within comics. So those are big inspirations for me.
I am an artist, a writer, a designer, and an educator. I'm also the publisher of Griot Enterprises and the creator of its flagship title, The Horseman, which is the story of the gods of Africa returning to Earth and possessing 7 people to save humanity from itself. I'm also the curator of the 4 pages, 16 bars, a visual mixtape anthology series, which is an anthology series focusing on independent works from creators of color. I am currently working on way too many things. Number one, this week, we are re-releasing probably our most controversial title. Not probably, it is the most controversial title I've ever worked on, JBD, The Devil's Due, which is a story of revolution. It is a story of nationalism, and it is a story of how to preserve, or the struggle to preserve, independence from outside forces. I also am finishing up an illustrated novel, completely different, called The Court, which is a mythic story of a father and a son in New York, and how basketball and injury brings them together and helps them both to find their way when they are lost. So that's what I'm doing currently. There's probably more stuff if I think about it.
As an artist, one thing I like to say is that I like to hang around in the space between reality and metaphor. So I like to think about things in terms of like try to look deeper beyond uh, what's immediately present, but also my art is very grounded in like the physical. So I try to I try to represent the physical, but also like try and push beyond that and try to represent some of the metaphor behind that. So I think a very representative piece, we can look at that later, is one called Catch Yourself. And it was in the Columbus Scribbler last year. And it's basically a piece where it talks about when you fall, right? Like, how do you catch yourself? So you can catch yourself in terms of like, oh, you've made a mistake, and I've caught you red-handed, and I can judge myself, or I can like hold myself and like break the fall kind of thing. So that's an example, but yeah, so that's what I like to where I like to kind of hang out.
I've been working on a comic with my partner. It's still in the works. It's still like very like baby stages. I plan to like get it finished and release. I want to say October, November is what I'm aiming for. So it's just like something that like has been like helping me out, like working on it. I've had this idea for a while. With my partner, he was the one that wrote it, and then I was the one that like kind of like penciled it, inked it, and then like illustrated it. And so it's my first horror comic that we are coming up with, and like this is kind of like a mock-up of what it's going to look like. This is just me like planning it out and stuff, just to kind of see of what it's going to look like. It's a lot easier for me as a illustrator and like working traditionally to kind of see like a physical copy. So like, as you can see, it's like binder clipped and stuff. But like it's going to be a 40-page comic, which is the longest and technically the first comic I've ever made. Like I've made zines before that have like a bit of a storyline, but nothing like what you would consider like a comic. So this is like one of my bigger projects that I've had, but it's been really fun to like work on it.
With Prism Stalker over here, that's a psychedelic sci-fi adventure story. I'm working on the second volume right now, and it deals with themes of colonization, imperialism, and is really meant to explore like being complicit in power structures and institutions that you really are forced to be a part of, and the sticky, complicated, tangled nature of living in a world where you have to be involved with those things. Of course, and this has like the sheen of a very like adventure, like shonen manga style comic. So there's a lot of fun bits, there's psychic martial arts, but there's also a lot of very like contemplative, broody scenes with this character dealing with just like what she's being forced to carry, both like in her heritage and how she's expected to enact her will on this new world that she's being forced to help colonize. So yeah, those are my two main works right now.
What mediums do I work in, and what do I like? I am a traditional artist. I basically started on pencil and paper, upgraded to like, India ink, Bristol when I do my comic books. For me, the hand is very, very important. But when it comes to things like cartoons or animation, I used to do cartoons and animation on paper, like the good old like onion skin paper and pencil flip book style. But as it progressed, I realized that using a computer made it all the more efficient, and I was able to kind of utilize it a lot better with Wacom and doing it digitally. It's still hand drawn because I'm still basically using a stylus and going frame by frame as I would in a regular traditional cartoon, except now I have sort of the freedom of not having gigantic stacks of paper all over my closet in my room. And, then I lost, page number 150 out of 2000 something. So, it just made it so much easier. But then when a lot of people were like, well, why don't you go to digital with your comic books? I am a classical painter. I do acrylics, gouache, watercolors. And that was just something that I just felt didn't work for me, for my comic book. I really loved black and white ink. Probably biggest influences were like Creepy, Eerie, Tales from the Crypt, and if you've seen any of those, they're really stark, like black and white kind of style comic books. And so I felt like In the Dark really needed that. And like you can just get these cool, happy accents sometimes with the medium, with ink. You can make these splatters and just like, cross hatchings that just look really cool, raw, violent. That's kind of the whole, what the nature of the book is like. So that's kind of where it went.
I start off working traditionally. Like I sketch out like everything like traditionally, and then I work in ink. So I use like my Series 7 like brush and use like India ink, and then I scan everything and then I color digitally.
I'm pretty old school. I like the feel of being at a drawing table, drafting table, with my pens, my pencils, the markers, all the old school stuff. And I incorporate a bit of the new school by scanning those images in and then taking the digital approach from there. I know it's a bold new world for this old man. So I'm just looking at a lot of my peers who have made the transition from the drafting table to the tablet. And I've worked with it a few times, but I'm just too set in my old school ways to just make the complete leap from paper to tablet. So I still, work in that, area, but on certain projects, like with the animation aspect, I work alongside a lot of people who are a lot more seasoned than I am in the realm of animation. So I try to do a lot of the digital to accommodate them. And then when I'm doing my comic books, I'm just back to old school tactics and methods and what I call my weapons of war, which are the pencils and the inks and the pens and such.
Like Crystal, of course, I started off what I like to call analog because I remember a time before computers in producing this work. So, I have done the, pencil, pen, and ink, the T-square, the triangle, the Bristol board, the whole nine. As it has evolved and where I am right now, I kind of call myself more so of a collagist than a classical illustrator at this point because, I still do rough drawings in blue pencil, but now I scan them in and my weapons of choice are Photoshop and Illustrator, of course, to create the images, create the text, so on and so forth, and then InDesign to lay out the whole project. So especially over the past couple of years, I found myself really leaning into the design aspect, being a collagist. And honestly, when I feel like I'm working on the computer and not using a stylus, I don't feel necessarily like an illustrator. That is kind of weird because I know so many people are now working digitally, and it's smart to work digitally, and that's why I'm working digitally, because it sort of condenses the workflow into one space. With that being said, I am still a fan of the analog process as opposed to the digital process. And I take that sort of analog thinking and apply it to the digital work. Because again, you know, the computer is not a creative thinking tool. It is a box, and it takes a creative thinker to use the programs to their desired outcome, if that's the best way to put it. So definitely, even though I'm doing a lot of quote unquote collaging work, the way that I work is that I want to make sure that it feels like a page. I want to make sure that it feels like, you know, the intent is there and the feeling is there, and you still get that vibe. Like making sure that when I'm using a computer, that the work that I produce is not cold and unfeeling, but warm and accessible and visceral, and it hits people in the gut, and they still want to, you know, read it. And even though everybody knows we use these tools, like, it's like, yeah, you know, I use Photoshop, but do you use Photoshop the way that I use Photoshop? Therein lies the magic. Therein lies the artistry, right? It's not that the program makes me a better artist, is that I just use the program as a different medium. The same way that I would use a pen, the same way that I would use a pencil, the same way that I would use a paintbrush, you know, the same way that I think about color. All of that is still here, right? It's not in the computer, it's still here. And I have to access what I know and what I'm studying and what I'm learning and apply it to my work in order, again, to create work that I enjoy and that hopefully other people enjoy, but more importantly, that other people feel.
It has the media that I work with typically are pencil and pen and ink. So that's what I've been most comfortable with. I can ramble a little bit about, you know, how I started drawing was, you know, I grew up in India, and, you know, we lived in apartments where the floor was concrete. So I would just sit and draw with chalk on the floor and then wipe it clean and then start over. And yeah, so, and that was, you know, my preferred medium, but then I moved from that and it wasn't sustainable. So I moved to pencil from that. And then, yeah, and then pen and ink. And then eventually, like just about 2 years ago, I started seriously teaching myself how to draw digitally. One of the reasons was like this program called Sketchbook came available, and then so I decided to try it out, and it was, you know, it was really great. I you know, enjoyed a lot of the benefits that provides, the ability, you know, other than the obvious like undo redo abilities, but then also like being able to layer and then, you know, different textures without, you know, spending hours and hours layering up the textures with pencil or charcoal or whatever. The other advantage to that was also I didn't have like a good process of making my art. So like anytime I did, it was just the original piece that I finished, and then I would just give it to somebody. So like, you know, if it was a commission or whatever, that was very rare. But like I would just do things for people where I just drew on a paper and then gave it to them. And like, you know, I didn't have scans of it or prints of it or anything like that. So yeah, so doing it digitally has kind of made that a little easier because I can still have the files stashed away and I can, you know, do what I want with them. But yeah, so I think the media that I'm most comfortable with right now is still pencil and pen and ink. But then, yeah, I'm slowly getting better at digital. So
when I was growing up, I didn't have cable. I was basically, you know, watching those $1 VHS tapes that you get, you know, that have nothing but like copyright domain free 1920 cartoons. So, you know, Popeye, Felix the Cat, Betty Boop. And, you know, I realized that like as a kid, that wasn't the kind of cartoons a lot of people were watching. You know, they were watching Care Bears and, you know, a lot of 80s, 90s cartoons that, you know, nobody had heard of these other characters. And one thing I also noticed was like they were completely uncensored. Like everything else, they were like smoking, drinking, flaunting, super violent, and I actually thought they were super funny. Like for me, dark humor was very much ingrained as even a young, kid or whatnot. And I loved it, but I realized that not everybody agreed or nor liked that kind of stuff. And I was always like, that's kind of interesting. I wonder why that's, the case. And as I was, studying painting and art and whatnot, I took a lot of art courses, art history, and I was noticing even in like the Renaissance times, I was like super into Bosch, and it was all like these crazy like scenarios, big giant paintings with like creatures and demons and everything. And I was like, wait a minute, how's he allowed to even paint this stuff? Because back then that was completely taboo. You weren't supposed to draw any of that. And he's like, well, there's commentary involved in it, so that's why I'm allowed to, And it was like, oh, okay, so I see. Because of the fact that he was actually kind of trying to, show the criticisms of these things, he was allowed to do it. So I thought that was interesting. It was like, okay, so I guess that's how you can get through making things that are not supposed to be seen in that time, right? But I still feel like, nowadays we have cartoons that are still being censored. And I mean, in the 90s, actually, it was actually more violent than it is now. Like now it's like, you can't say anything, you can't do anything in terms of like, having like an adult cartoon, something that, and that's another stigma. It's like cartoons are only for children. And it's like, no, animation itself, is, it's a medium. It's not a genre. Like that in itself should be something that you use to tell whatever kind of stories you'd like, whether that be adult or kid or drama or sci-fi or, there's all these different, places that medium can be used. And for me, I always felt that animation, because I'm influenced by 1930s cartoons, it just didn't have that adult feel anymore. And I just kind of really liked the dark humor that was part of the elements of that, which is why I think I kind of went that route when I started making my cartoons. Schizo, the 1920s Killer Bear, is basically a throwback to 1930s cartoons, but with a more horrific twist, that dark humor that I, really gravitate to.
I've accepted long ago that I'm a child of the 70s and the 80s. So when it comes to comic book art, that's still a huge influence. In terms of my influences, I'm that George Perez, John Byrne, Alan Davis, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez kind of artist. I'm that artist that likes, somewhat real world proportions, a little bit of cartoony flavor, that sort of thing. That's my root. At the same time, being an artist and being trained academically as an artist allow me to open up and see other art movements. So at the same time, I can be inspired by street art or graffiti. I can be inspired by Alphonse Mucha or J.C. Leyendecker, or of course Frank Frazetta or Boris Vallejo, or Bill Sienkiewicz. I like looking at artists whose styles are similar to the way that I view the world, and also styles that are not similar to the way that I view the world. It just allows me, it gives me a broader reference base to draw from.
Or my earliest impressions from comics were these syndicated strips that came in the local newspaper called The Times of India. And so, and they were the two main comic strips that influenced me were Mandrake the Magician and The Phantom, both of which were drawn, or actually they were authored by this American guy named Lee Falk, and then drawn by Cy Berry. And Cy Berry's art was like my favorite. It was just amazing, and even now I think I can, point directly to him as my influence of like the way I draw characters, people, postures, all of that. And so there were a few others. There was a comic that was, a little above my, age appropriateness at the time, called Modesty Blaze, and it was like this super really cool comic. I think it was like Australian. I can't even remember, but she was this like woman detective, and there was this guy who was basically her sidekick, who needed to come in, like when she needed the muscle, he would be there, but like, she could totally, rock on her own. Like she could fight, she would solve cases, like all of that. Like, it was really, really cool. Even now that I reflect on it, like I wish I'd read more of that than, some of the other stuff. But again, the art was amazing on that. And I do not remember who the artist was. But then, those were all like influences. So like, again, very realistic looking, even, Cy Berry's superheroes were all still very like, realistic looking. They didn't look, like steroid influenced or like, so, yeah, so that was definitely a big influence. And then, I read other comics going, further along into my career. The DC Comics was, a big thing. But then and there was almost like a direct line that you can draw from Phantom to Batman. And like, in fact, Stanley, I believe, even talked about like Phantom being an influence on, or not Stanley, sorry, Jack Kirby, talked about, that being an influence. But anyway, so, I took to Batman once I started reading comics here in the US. But so a lot of my drawing still looks like that, and like the way I frame my scenes and such. But then, yeah, the themes have obviously moved on to other things.
I grew up in a time of comics where there was a shortage of characters of color. And this was at a time where we had a Black Panther. There was a time, that we had a Luke Cage, even the original Captain Marvel. You know what I mean? So with all of these characters of color, and I jump in, around the late 80s, and they're very much like absent from the narrative, and they're not being used as or pushed to the forefront as their white counterparts. So it took a while, and then I guess in the early 90s there was that big boom, and then we got Static, and then we got Hardware and Tribe, and so many faces of color across the board in the realm of comics. And a lot of those images and artists that brought those characters to the table are very big influences for me. I remember being seeing Uncanny X-Men. I think it was number 248, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it was either 248, 247, somewhere in that era. That I was introduced to the works of Jim Lee. And I saw Jim Lee's stuff, and I was just like, yeah, this is what I want to do for a living. I want to do this. But even to take it further back than that, I remember being a kid growing up, watching anything that Hanna-Barbera had their stamp on. Scooby-Doo, Flintstones, Jabberjaw. You can, the animation aspect. So while my peers at that point, like when I was about 5 or 6 years old, were concerned about collecting the merchandise attached to those characters, I was like, how do they make these drawings move? Because I had enough common sense about myself to understand that, they were drawings. And I wanted to know what, the process on how they made these drawings come to life.
So I grew up in Hawaii, and there's like no comics or like relevant art scene for me there. There's no comic shop. So my like career basically got started using social media. Like in the really early days, I had like a DeviantArt, I had Twitter, then I had Tumblr. And that's how I started getting work, was basically just like cultivating not like friends, but I would follow like editors or publishers or other published cartoonists. So it's always been a very core part of how I've made my career. But I feel like maybe within the past 5 years, it's very like people's personas and like their work persona and like their real life persona have like merged into one. And I find that very difficult to grapple with as an artist, especially because not that I don't want to like influence my audience, but to me, the audience, like a reader and my comic, they're going to have their own relationship together without me. So, but I feel like right now, a lot of readers, like they want to hear the creators talk about their work. They want to engage with them. And that becomes like part of their relationship with the book, is their relationship with the author as well through social media, which I'm not like crazy about. Like if we do like have an interaction with like, if I have an interaction with a reader, like I hope they don't like always take that in like, I don't know, like incorporate that into their impressions with my art, because they can, I don't know, the art comes from such a different place. Like it's not always like a straight like message that I'm trying to send through an art. Like a lot of my stories are me trying to explore something, and I may not always have an answer to that, and it may not always be an answer that I believe is right per se. I'm not trying to like teach people through my work. And I feel like especially right now there's an atmosphere with towards creators where people want the work they could consume to be a little bit like didactic, like, and have like the morals of the story be very stark, very black and white, which I find like not a great atmosphere to be in. I feel like it flattens the work. It like loses depth and nuance. And not that I don't understand that like urge to want to have like clear and like morally parsable stories, but to me that's not where like the rich art comes from.
I definitely pull stuff from like my culture and stuff. I'm Mexican and Chilean, so that theme definitely goes through like my illustrations. I've always had a really strong like women figures in my life, so that definitely like comes through my artwork. And I always try to do artwork that like kind of embodies like stuff that I aspire to be. So it's always like very like cool fashion and like strong women and like very like bold design, and like it transfers to that.